I'm working on some braces for guitar I'm planning on making in the near future. And for this project I needed some quarter sawn spruce and maple boards. But I didn't have any quarter sawn stock in my shop. All my stock is plain or flat sawn. So my question is, could I make some quarter sawn boards from some regular plain stock? So that's what I'm planning on doing today. I'm going to be taking some boards such as this piece of maple. And you can see the grain on that. It's running almost like 45 degrees on there. And if I cut the black line, I can get a piece of quarter sawed wood from this piece of maple. So that's the plan. I could cut this on a table saw. However, cutting angles on a table saw, especially like 45 degrees, can be quite dangerous. You're putting it on a table saw, you're tilting the blade, and there's usually not much support, and a piece of wood can kick out very easily. So I prefer not to do this on the table saw. A bandsaw will be much safer. So what I'm planning on doing is taking this board, I'll be gluing this to an MDF backing board or sacrificial fence for my Accu-Slice system. Then I'll attach this to my Accu-Sled II sled, and then tilting the bandsaw table to give me the correct angle. So that's the first board I'll be cutting. Then I have a second board, a little bit larger board. The same thing. You can see the angle of the grain, and by cutting that on that black lines, I can create a larger piece of quarter sawn maple. And again, the same process. I'll be gluing this to an MDF backing board, and then attaching it to my Accu-Sled II, and then cutting those angles. And I might even be able to cut both angles on this larger piece of wood. We'll see how that works out. So the next step is to, first of all, just glue these to a piece of MDF, and then we'll attach it to the Accu-Sled II fence. I glued my first board to this MDF sheet. It's been drying for about 2 hours. So let me go ahead and attach it to the Accu-Sled II. And this board is 30 inches long, which is the exact length of my Accu-Sled II tray. So the way I like to clamp it. Again, what I like to happen, I like the board to ride on the bandsaw table, so it has, reduced vibration by riding on the bandsaw table, but not bind. So it's got to go through without binding. So I pre-drill the holes. And then screw them in place using these number 8 1-inch long panel board screws. In the same manner, I drill holes in the 2 remaining L brackets and then attach the panel screws to hold it in place. I like using all 6 screws to hold it in place. It just makes it more stable. So let me lock this in place so it doesn't move as I tilt the table. So next thing, I'm going to tilt the table to 45 degrees. And I actually have a indicator here that I can actually set the angle accurately. So release the clamps on the bandsaw table. So I'm releasing both clamps on the bandsaw table, tilting it, and then accurately setting it to 45 degrees. And then lock it back in place. And I'm exactly at 45 degrees. So the table's locked in place. Now I need to move this to the left and advance it so that I cut my first cut. Now let me go ahead and I'll move the board so I cut right close to my line. Release my mag jigs. There's a lot of weight on the bandsaw table due to the angle I'm cutting, so I need to use care in moving and clamping the Accu-Slice in place. I first clamp the Accu-Slice table in place using the coarse adjustment screws on the Accu-Slice system. I then use the index wheel to move the board to the correct position that I want to cut. And that's pretty close. Now I'll lock my mag jig clamps. So everything's locked here. This carriage will slide on the rail, and I'll go ahead and cut this first piece of wood off to give me my first angle. So we're all set to cut. Let's lower this down so it's a little bit safer. By lowering the blade guides, I reduce the blade exposure, making it much safer to operate the bandsaw. Just making sure nothing's in the way, so it's free and clear. Okay, we're ready to do our first cut. Notice I'm making this cut, my hands are behind the sacrificial fence, far removed from the bandsaw blade, making this a very safe way to cut boards on the bandsaw. So now I'm going to go and make actually the second cut. And in making this second cut, I'm actually going to cut the sacrificial fence off two at the same time. I just got to make sure I don't cut into my bearings on the sled, so I'll watch that as I move it. So once again, I can release these. Let me see if I can just advance it with the index wheel. It is easier using the index wheel to advance the carriage rather than trying to move the whole assembly due to the weight of the system. Okay, that should be good. And I asked that I'm cutting the board, but I'm also cutting the whole corner off the sacrificial fence. So let me just check, make sure that I'm not cutting into my bearings. And we're totally clear, so we should be fine. So I need to raise my blade guides a hair so that it clears. So now we're ready to cut, so we'll be cutting two sides off that board. Lock my mag jigs in place. Double check it. And we look good. As we've shown in the past, the main advantage of the Accuslice system is safety. In addition, there's no blade drift with this technique, and the boards being cut are perfectly straight with smooth cut surfaces. Now we have our two parallel surfaces. Our grain runs this way. So I can put this back on the bandsaw, just a straight edge, and cut the other two sides. And we'll have our perfect quarter sawn piece of wood. And you see I did cut this piece of MDF off the sacrificial fence. I first of all remove the sled from the Accuslice rail. I return the bandsaw table to the horizontal position and then lock it in place with both handles. So now what I can do, I can actually use this rail as a fence and guide my board through it and cut this first piece off. I use the index wheel in the Accu-Slice system to move the rail back to give me the correct cutting position for my board. I also use a machinist square to make sure that the bandsaw table is perfectly perpendicular to the bandsaw blade. I next make sure that the bandsaw table is locked in position, verify my cutting position, and then lower my blade guides to minimize the exposure of the bandsaw blade. So my rail now is my fence, and I'll be making this first cut. Notice I'm standing on the opposite side of the bandsaw table, pushing the board against the rail and using a push stick to keep my fingers far away from the bandsaw blade. I once again use the index wheel to advance the rail to the correct position and lock it in place with the mag jig clamps. And now we have our perfect quarter sawn piece of wood, about 1 1/4 inch square. This is our second board, which is a little bit wider piece of wood. And once again, you can see the angle of the grain. So once again, I'll attach this to my carriage. Again, this board again is about 28 inches long, a little bit shorter. As was done previously, I once again use a clamp to clamp the sacrificial fence to the L bracket and pre-drill the holes and attach it with the screws. Again, all the time making sure that the system rides freely on a bandsaw and doesn't bind. Now the angle on this piece looks to be around 25 degrees. First of all, I make sure that the mag jigs and clamps are all locked tight in place. So once again, let me rotate the table. Also keep in mind that the Accu-Slice System and the Accu-Sled II carriage add a lot of weight to the bandsaw table. So you be careful in moving it. Okay, that should be right on. So I first try and get the table close to the position I need to cut, and then lock it in place with the two coarse adjustment knobs. I get it close and then dial in the remaining. It should be right there. Again, everything locked in place. I lowered the blade guides, making sure everything's clear. And now we're ready for the first cut. The reason there's no blade drift with the Accu-Slice system is because the board is mounted to a carriage that rides on a rail, so there's no lateral movement of the wood. The only movement of the wood is straight through the bandsaw blade. So there's the first piece of scrap off of that. And that was set at 25 degrees, or actually 65 degrees on the table. So I don't change the angle now, I just move the board to do the second cut. And this, I'm going to barely touch the sacrificial fence. So once again, I move the Accuslice carriage to get it close to my cutting position, and then do the final adjustment with the index wheel. So I'm just cutting the very bottom corner off the sacrificial fence to give me my second side. So again, everything's locked in place. Once again, I raise my blade guides. All the bandsaw cuts made in this video are actually shown at 4 times normal speed. I'm actually cutting quite slowly, because the slower you cut, the smoother the cuts. And here's our 2 parallel sides. Now I'll put this back on the bandsaw and cut off the other 2 sides. Remove the Accu-Sled carriage, return the bandsaw table to the horizontal position, and make sure the blade is perpendicular to the bandsaw table. And once again, I use my rail as a fence. Now I'll cut the other side off. And then we have our second quarter sawn board. Well, that completes this video on showing how to cut some quarter sawn boards from some plain sawed boards. It actually went much easier and smoother than I thought it would go. Actually, it was quite easy to do. The only issue is a lot of waste. So I'm cutting these boards a lot of waste. Now these pieces may be able to use for, something else, but there's a lot of waste. But in a crunch where you need some quarter sawn wood, you can make it from some plain sawed boards. And there's the results of the 2 boards. And these boards are all, one's 30 inches long, the other's about 28 inches long. And then those were cut using the Accu-Sled II with these 4 by 3 inch brackets, and using a piece of MDF to mount the board. So I cut 2 sides by tilting the table, and then put it back to 90 degrees and cut the remaining 2 sides. Once again, thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions or concerns, please give us a call or drop us an email.